Well, for more discussions on the refugee crisis, I spoke to David Begbie from Crossroads, a charity that helps some of the world's most vulnerable migrants. I asked him if newly arrived migrants really have the kind of collateral that countries like Denmark would use for means testing.
It's a great question. I think the reality is that the diversity of migrants reflects the diversity of humanity. You have people who leave with nothing, and it's desperation that drives them, and so with nothing they enter borders. You have people who leave with some resources, but during the process they are fleeced, or those items are taken from them by some of those who are trafficking or moving them from place to place. Then you have those who make it safely, and there are resources available to them initially, but when there is no livelihood or steady stream of income, even the little they bring will quickly evaporate, for want of a better word, and then suddenly they, going from middle class or even high positions in society, find themselves destitute in the new locations in which they've sought shelter.
Yeah, we're talking about people, aren't we? Some people who might have spent their life savings, their entire life savings, just to make that crossing.
It's absolutely the case. It's absolutely the case that money may have been borrowed from others to be able to make that journey. And the reality is that once they land, the hope for many is that then they'd be able to see a new means of livelihood, generating income to sustain them in their new lands. And yet for many places that they're visiting, it's very difficult for them to do.
Just staying with income a moment, the International Monetary Fund has come out with a new report today. I didn't really see an awful lot new in that about this refugee crisis. The one thing that did catch my eye was the IMF saying that one of the impediments for migrants starting new lives in European countries or wherever they go are things like barriers to actually working and getting a job and barriers to maybe starting their own business. Is that something you see?
It's something that I see across the planet. Certainly, when you look at the migration of displaced people, obviously the world is very familiar with the situations in Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan, but there are numerous nations where people are still being displaced, and as they seek shelter across our planet, often there are employment impediments that they face. Some of the nations in which they're operating, in order to be able to work, for example, they may need to receive a certain kind of status, and sometimes that process of vetting them can take 3 to 5 years. And so they're in a nation with no income. They're not even, in some instances, even allowed to volunteer, and yet somehow they have to survive that long wait before the approvals are passed, and they are then able to receive some form of livelihood. And so it is a very tricky situation. I was speaking recently, actually this morning, with the First Lady of Turkey, and it was a delight to be able to hear. She was saying to us that about 14 days ago, Turkey has passed laws that gives permission, with certain caveats, for those who are displaced inside of Turkey to now seek employment and actually contribute to part of the Turkish economy. And it's a delight to be able to see these kind of steps taken as nations explore how to integrate these new arrivals into their, not just into their societies, but into their economies, to strengthen and stabilize and perhaps even grow who they are and redefining them as a nation.
You sound optimistic. I'm afraid I'm not very optimistic. You're talking at the World Economic Forum to lots of leaders. We've got the world's best and brightest there. They can't fix this crisis, can they? Europe, we are seeing, is threatening to break apart because individual countries just cannot agree on how to take these migrants, and they can't agree on who should take them and how many.
I think the challenge for so many people is the scale. The reality is, I think for many, that the hope has been that somehow this problem would evaporate, this problem would disappear, that the Syrian refugee crisis, as some may term it, would evaporate, the war would finish, and that people could just simply go home. The reality is that is not going to occur. Very, very conservatively, there are over 59.5 million displaced people around the planet. And this is not a situation that will dissipate. What is required now is a repositioning, a re-understanding of societies. When you look at the 1930s, 1940s, across the planet, there was a wise opening of borders, a welcoming because of the plight that those had faced who were arriving, and then this question of how can we redefine what our societies look like. And then
just one second, David. You're talking about the 1940s. It was the Second World War we're talking about that kind of upended that. That's a pretty dramatic example.
I am sad to say that the numbers that we're looking at are far greater, even than the numbers that we were looking at in those years. And so, although the situation is different, it was not a world war in the conventional sense that we're facing now. It is a world issue that we are facing now. And so it will require reimagining of societies, reimagining of government policies, reimagining of what employment looks like so that we can be strengthening